My name is Paul Kenny, and I have the honour of being this year's TUC President, as well as being General Secretary of the GMB Union. And it's my pleasure to be opening the conference and chairing the morning session. Today is very important. And people who know me in the trade union movement know that part of my trademark almost in terms of making speeches and presentations is that I like to introduce a few funny lines and maybe a few jokes. There is nothing funny about unemployment. There is no jokes or quips that will lighten the burden of people suffering the ills of unemployment. And it's becoming more obvious every day, every passing day, that the austerity policies of this government and those across Europe are not working, either for the short term or the long term. And the symptoms are pretty obvious. Over 2.5 million people out of work. 250,000 young people unemployed for over a year. A disgrace for a modern economy. And the slowest economic recovery on record, even worse than after the Great Depression. Inflation still rising faster than wages, and that means families across the country are facing an unprecedented squeeze on their living standards. Until our economy starts to grow, strongly grow, there is little prospect of things getting better. In one sense, the alternative is obvious. End cuts that are depressing the economy when it's already down. Stimulate investment and create jobs must be our clear priorities. The big challenge is how, in the medium and longer term, we can build, in the words of the TUC, a future that works. The problems we face today are not simply the result of mistaken policies of this government, even if they are making them worse. Nor is it enough merely to suggest this all started in the 2008 banking crash. The truth is, in 2008 was not the start of our problems, but the result of decades of a wrong view about how a modern economy can be made to work. Instead of delivering prosperity for the many, it worked for just the few. And those countries, and some of our speakers today will no doubt remind us, who ignored the UK-US worldview, did the best. Let us today set out some further ideas. Inequality matters. Allowing a new super-rich global elite to float free is not just morally offensive, but bad economics. Manufacturing matters. It is not enough to think that a country like the UK can bank its way to prosperity. Services are important, and even finance has its place, but making things is as important as it has ever been. The environment matters. If letting the markets rip can't get the finance sector to work, then it certainly can't deal with the environmental challenges we face. This is relatively easy to say, but reversing the failed consensus of 3 decades will not be easy. How do we get growth that comes from real rises in family incomes rather than from unsustainable debt bubbles? How do we support and grow our manufacturing firms rather than rely on the financial sector? How do we make corporate Britain act in the best economic interests of the country, not simply to line its own pockets? These are some of the issues that we'll be debating today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you as well as our impressive array of speakers. We have a wide range of participants with us today. Over 300, I said, have registered, from charities, think tanks, government, Parliament, as well as the unions. We are all, I hope, in for a highly stimulating day. One for new ideas, maybe, new discussion, and let us hope a major contribution to forging a new consensus on how to build an economic model that delivers jobs, prosperity, and a fair, fulfilling society that ends the fear of insecurity and poverty that is a reality for far too many in our society today, not just in the UK, but also across Europe and across the world. A future that delivers hope for young people, not homelessness.
We get through the current economic crisis, but how do we also lay the foundations for our future prosperity? And I sense that Britain, like Europe, is at a historically important crossroads. And it seems to me we have a fundamental choice to make. We can continue as we are, along the self-defeating path of austerity, stagnation, and decline. Or we can take a different direction towards growth, recovery, and renewal. And for the TUC, it simply has to be the latter. And this morning, I want to talk about why that will mean fundamental change. Not piecemeal reform, not tinkering around the edges, but ditching an economic model that has taken us to the brink of the abyss, and instead finding the courage to do things differently. Because only then will we be able to build a fairer, stronger, and greener economy for the long term. But before I describe the journey we need to take, I want to put our discussion today in a bit of context. Because it's no exaggeration to say that we're living through the most turbulent economic period of our lifetimes. Britain is in double-dip recession. The Eurozone remains in turmoil, with the markets now rounding on Spain. A second banking crisis looms, and much of the developed world is suffering the worst slump since the Great Depression. I was at the G20 summit in Mexico last weekend, and there I got the impression that global policymakers feel increasingly powerless to respond to a crisis that is entering new and dangerous territory. Here in Britain, the government is pushing ahead with its Plan A, despite compelling evidence that its severe ideological spending cuts are making a bad situation worse. It's little more than a rehash of 1930s Treasury thinking, a misplaced belief in so-called expansionary contraction. Well, if that sounds like nonsense, that's because it is nonsense. 2 years on from the coalition's emergency budget, and it's clear that austerity is destroying growth, destroying jobs, and destroying confidence. None of the government's assumptions have been proved right. It promised to eradicate the deficit within this Parliament, but the reality is that borrowing has gone up by £109 billion, with austerity now planned to continue until at least 2017. It promised recovery with growth of 2.8% in 2012, but the reality is double-dip recession and Britain facing years of stagnation. It promised that the private sector would power recovery, but the reality is UK PLC sitting on a record cash pile and afraid to invest. And it promised an export-led recovery, but the reality is our trade deficit has just reached its widest level in 7 years. Conference, the government has failed to heed one of the central lessons of economic history, that austerity simply begets austerity. Consider this: of the 173 austerity packages carried out around the world since the 1970s, the IMF concluded that all led to recession, not growth. So we urgently need a new approach that frees us from this spiral of deflation, depression, and despair. We need deficit reduction based on growth, not cuts, an intelligent stimulus program, a smart plan to get people back to work, a strategy to rebuild demand and reboot living standards. And we need all of this to happen at European and global level, as well as here in Britain. But as we set out our alternative to austerity, we also need to address the much broader challenge of how we build a new economy for the long term, one that's more balanced, more sustainable, and yes, more equal too. What we need is a new economic paradigm for a new age. Now, I don't propose to describe this process in detail, nor to set out a long shopping list of changes. There isn't time. But from the TUC's perspective, there are three key priorities policymakers here in Britain have to embrace. First priority, we need a financial system that works for us, not for itself. It sounds obvious, and indeed it is, but without radical reform of the city, we'll simply sleepwalk back to the systemic fault lines that led to the crash of 2008. If there's one statistic that illuminates how lopsided our economy had become, then it's this. In 2007, the banks invested 16 times more buying derivatives from each other than they did investing in British manufacturing. A shocking state of affairs. In place of financial speculation, we need banks that meet the needs of real businesses and real workers in the real economy. Now, the TUC broadly welcomed the report of the Independent Commission on Banking led by John Vickers, but we were disappointed by the government's response in the subsequent white paper. Instead of timidity, we need to go much further in reforming the banks, not just through more effective regulation, not just through a new financial transactions tax, which would act as a brake on excessive speculation, but through measures that promote sensible, sustainable investment for the long term. Because for us, the central question is not how we make the banks safe, imperative though that is, it's how we make them useful. The bank's reluctance to lend to non-financial firms has meant that over the course of the past 3 decades, UK investment has been either the lowest or the second lowest of any of the G7 countries. But with Britain needing to invest around £450 billion to build new infrastructure and nurture a greener economy, we surely need fundamental change. Rather than lurching from one extreme to another, we want credit to flow where it's needed and when it's needed. That's why the TUC is calling for a new state investment bank, for a properly capitalised green investment bank, and for regional banks too. And this takes me directly to our second priority. We need to nurture the industrial success stories of the future. For far too long, policymakers simply bet the house on the city in the naive belief that its wealth would trickle down to the rest of us. As the financial commentator Anthony Hilton argued back in 2008, the entire UK economy has become, in effect, a giant hedge fund with a massive one-way bet on financial services and no plan B for the day when the city goes off the boil. Well, now is surely the time for that plan B, a long-term vision to correct the dangerous structural imbalances that have been allowed to take hold in Britain. That's why we need an intelligent German-style industrial strategy to help us grow sectors where Britain has the potential to lead the world, such as pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, renewables, aerospace, the creative industries. That's why we need a clear, coherent strategy to help us meet the challenges posed by climate change, facilitating a just transition by delivering the green skills, green jobs and green industries in the regions that need them most. And that's why right across the full spectrum of policy, we need an explicit focus on good, skilled jobs that pay a decent wage and help us break free from the low-wage, low-skill, low-productivity equilibrium that still disfigures too much of our labour market. And this takes me straight to what must be our third priority: fair rewards for all, something that is absolutely central to the task of economic renewal. It's abundantly clear that the financial capitalism of the past 3 decades has enriched too few and failed far too many. And this inequality came to have catastrophic consequences. The trends are clear for all to see. Since the late 1970s, the share of GDP going to workers' wages has been falling, with those in the middle and at the bottom hit hardest. And as wages have stagnated, household debt in Britain has soared. In the United States, where real wages failed to grow for 3 decades, the result was the explosive growth of the subprime mortgage market. But at the other end of the spectrum, rich corporations and individuals have simply got richer. According to a study by the Credit Suisse Research Institute, the richest 0.5% now own over 1/3 of the world's wealth. And this has created a vast pool of footloose global capital looking for the quickest returns, a factor behind the rapid growth of financial markets, securitization, and speculative trading over the past few decades. It was this confluence of forces, spiraling debt, subprime mortgages, and financialization that 4 years ago took us to the edge of meltdown. But in this post-crash world, I sense that the tectonic plates are shifting with a growing clamour for greater equity in the distribution of wealth. From the success of the Occupy movement to the nascent shareholder spring, with investors voting down out-of-control executive pay, we're seeing now a reaction against excess at the top. So now is really the time to address these destabilizing inequalities of wealth. And this isn't about the politics of envy. It's about plain common sense. As IMF Chief Christine Lagarde observed just last week, countries with more equitable distribution of income are associated with greater macroeconomic stability and more sustainable growth over the longer term. Indeed, a recent IMF working paper argued that we need to increase the bargaining power of low and medium income earners. Unfortunately, of course, the UK government is once again heading off along completely the wrong path. It's attacking employment rights that already rank among the weakest in the OECD, despite evidence that employers do not regard them as a burden. It's thinking about regional pay for public servants, despite evidence that a 1% reduction in pay rates would take almost £2 billion out of regional economies. And it's cutting tax credits by up to £2,500, despite evidence that this will reduce the income of those groups most likely to spend. Instead, we should be going in precisely the opposite direction. And whether it's stronger employment rights, a living wage, worker representation on company boards and remuneration committees, compulsory reporting of pay differentials, a bigger role for unions and collective bargaining, there is plenty we could be doing and should be doing. Ultimately, the aim must be this: to move from the debt-fueled growth of the recent past to wage-driven growth in the future. So there you go, a whistle-top tour of the TUC's 3 key priorities for a stronger and more sustainable economy. Fair rewards for all, a better industrial balance, and a financial system that genuinely works for us. Now, I don't pretend for a moment that we've delivered definitive answers to what are fiendishly complex questions. All of this is work in progress. And the debate about the post-austerity economy perhaps remains still in its infancy. But as the voice of working people and organised labour, we in the trade union movement have an important contribution to make in setting out the contours of a new economic settlement. We agree with Christine Lagarde that jobs must be at the forefront of any strategy for inclusive growth. We applaud her recognition of the need for decent and steady employment. But this won't happen by accident. It requires new thinking, new policies, and the courage to ditch the discredited orthodoxies of the past. Back in the early 1980s, the right told us that the solutions to our economic woes were simple: deregulation, greater freedom for employers, flexible labour markets, and above all, a bigger role for finance capital. But far from fixing our long-standing structural problems, this free market free-for-all in fact exacerbated them, and the result was the worst crash in 80 years. Well, conference, out of crisis must come change, and it's up to us to shape what comes next, to forge a new economic model and to translate that vision into a bold policy agenda. So let's get to work. Let's show what a fairer, stronger economy would look like. And let's show that there can be no going back to business, banking, or bonuses as usual.
And what I want to talk about, I want to go through this a little bit. I want to talk about how did it get to be the case that, basically we reverse Keynes. Certainly your government here, many governments across Europe, how do we get this idea of expansionary contraction? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I promise not to bore you in, long economic models, but just want to say a little bit about that. Then I want to go through a little bit of the logic, because I think it's always, economists, I think a lot of economics is about making simple things difficult. And I think really the story here is actually fairly simple. When you think about it in a fairly simple way, it doesn't make sense. I know most of you know that, but I just want to drive that home and reinforce that. And then say a little bit about some items on the progressive agenda, because we want to think, and Brendan's absolutely right. We want to get back to something resembling full employment. We don't want to just get back to where we were in 2007. It's not as though things were great before the crash. We were already on a wrong path. That's why we ended up with the crash and the downturn. So I want to get back to full employment, but we want to talk about a different economy, a different society. So I want to at least throw out a few things, a few issues there. Okay, the first thing, the evidence of expansionary contraction. I was sort of amazed because, as soon as, we got the downturn in 2008, and, fortunately, at least the initial reaction, with the G20 meeting, and I forget where the first one and the second was in the U.S., and, everyone sort of agreed, okay, we have to have stimulus. And there was sort of a concerted effort at stimulus across the different G20 countries, and some countries did more, some did less. But that was the general agreement. We're all going to have stimulus. This is March, or maybe it was April of 2009. But then by the fall of that year, suddenly they said, okay, we did enough stimulus, now we have to contraction. So I was like, where on earth did they get this? Where did they get this? So, I went back looking through the literature, and it was stuff I was familiar with. I just didn't realize people had taken it so seriously. The main villain is someone you might have heard of, Alberto Alcino. He's a Harvard economist. And he'd written a number of papers that ostensibly found that contraction is expansionary. So he looked at different cases where governments had cut spending, raised taxes, and they had growth. And he, a few other things he threw in there. He found spending cuts were better than tax increases. He found spending cuts, if you cut spending, then that had more of an effect in boosting your economy than if you raised taxes. And best thing was to cut social spending. So cut, retiree benefits, welfare benefits. He found that had the most impact. So he had these results, and this is stuff that people were touting. I gather your government here has been touting it, but certainly across Europe, people are pushing the austerity line. We have in the United States, of course, as well. They're pushing this guy's work. There's other work as well. Goldman Sachs did a paper, came out with very similar conclusions. There's a few other economists here and there you could point to. Well, this was kind of surprising, and I looked at some of the research, and you find out it's very tentative, and I won't go into all details, but what was really nice was the IMF looked at the research, and they did a very, very good job. And I say this as someone who's not, in general, very respectful of the IMF. I mean, I think the IMF, if you look at its track record in the world over the last 4 decades, it's probably done more harm than good. But in this case, they did exactly what you'd want them to do. What they did was they said, let's look at this evidence, and let's look at it very closely. And first thing they did was they said, well, if we're going to say we want to have a policy of austerity, let's look at policy-driven austerity. My point in emphasizing that is that it's difficult to measure when a government is actually adopting austerity without looking at their actual policies rather than just looking at the deficits. What I mean by this, the best example I could say for the United States, but I'm sure it's true for the UK and most other countries, if you look at the late 90s, we went from a budget deficit to a budget surplus. We didn't raise taxes. We didn't cut spending. How did we go from a budget deficit? But we had great growth. We had really good growth. We had a stock market that went through the roof. Capital gains collections went. That wasn't austerity. That was really good growth. Well, in Alcino's data, that was austerity. Okay, that was really bad economics, but that's what he was doing and that's what he was pushing. So what the IMF said, no, we're going to look at where there was actually policy decisions. Where did governments cut spending? Where did they raise taxes? They went back, looked through the legislative record. When did Parliament, when did Congress cut spending, raise taxes? The second thing they did was they made a point of distinguishing between when are you going for austerity. Is it in the downturn? Is it in an economic slump like what we're facing today? Or is it in an expansion? And the logic there's a mainstream economics, which, you know, I'll concede has a certain logic to it. When you're approaching full employment, let's say we're back in 07, the unemployment rate in the U.S. was 4.5. I think you were pretty comparable here. You know, you have a high level of employment. There's actually an argument to be made that government is diverting resources from the private sector. Now, whether they're better used or not in the private sector, you could argue that. But there's an argument that, you know, in that context, the government's diverting resources. That's at least a plausible argument. It's not a plausible argument when you're sitting there with 8% unemployment, like, or 8.2, what we have in the U.S. I think you're about 8.4 here. You know, it's not a plausible argument in that case. So the IMF distinguished between situations where you were in the middle of a slump, you were in a contraction, and situations where you were in expansion. You know, the economy was booming. And what they found was very interesting. What they found was essentially that you could tell the story that, yeah, austerity can be expansionary in the first case when you're in an expansion. You know, so if in 2007 you had budget cuts, maybe that would have boosted the economy. Or in the U.S., 2000, you know, if we go back to the year 2000, maybe that would have boosted the economy further. But when you're in a contraction, what they found was what we all know. Contraction, austerity, contraction is contractionary. It makes things worse, not better. The other thing that they found that was very interesting, and, you know, again, not surprising to me, but it certainly overturned, you know, Alessina's conclusions, was that it didn't make a difference whether you had spending cuts or tax increases. They had the same effect. The difference depended on the response of central banks. So they found that central banks were more likely to accommodate spending cuts with lower interest rates than they were tax increases. Now, you could argue whether that's a good policy or bad policy, but the point was it was the central bank policy that led to a different outcome. It wasn't simply the spending cuts or tax increases. So in other words, we could say insofar as we want to see deficits reduced, not this year, probably not next year, but let's say, you know, 2014, 15, 16, when there may actually be an issue of deficits being too large, spending cuts and tax increases could be seen as equally appropriate. It's not as though we should be singling out spending cuts. Okay, well that was the, you know, the state of the professional debate, the economic debate. And I should point out, I think, you know, the IMF's work, you know, other people have done some work, we've done some work, and there's a lot of other people have done some work in the issue, but the IMF work, I think, really stands out as pretty conclusive at this point, that it has a lot of respect within the profession, and really undermined the intellectual case for this idea of expansionary contraction. Now, we could just look, because we have, let's see if we have enough countries that have tried this route. I just put a few here. I originally had about 10 countries down. I realized no one's going to be able to make it out. But I just wanted to put a few countries down here. We keep getting different success stories. The reason why we keep getting different success stories is invariably the success stories don't hold up. So I have Ireland up there, and some of you may recall in 2010, its economy was showing signs of growth. Ireland had serious austerity. They had big budget cutbacks. They cut back their minimum wage. A lot of big cutbacks. They basically did everything that proponents of austerity would want. Probably even a step beyond the government here. Not much good here. Their unemployment rate's still going up. I think it's pretty much leveled out now, but it's at over 14%. Spain has gone whole hog the austerity route. They're at 24%. I think they might be at 25% in the latest data. I mean, just a horrible story there. Youth unemployment's over 50%. Some of the others, some of you might have heard about Latvia. They're touting Latvia, and it's almost humorous. I mean, in the U.S., everyone's very U.S.-centric, so you talk about anywhere else in the world, no one cares. Maybe Canada a little bit, but Latvia, you hold up Latvia, it's almost a joke to start with. But Latvia, of course, has gone the austerity route. They're not actually in the euro, but they're linked to the euro. And a lot of us are saying, well, why don't you just break the link, like your currency? They said, no, we're not going to do that. We want to get in the euro. We're going to be good boys and girls. And so they went the austerity route. And what's happened, there tells the success story. Their economy is growing. Its GDP is still down about 5% from its 2007 level, and its unemployment rate is still about 15%. And what makes that even worse, they go, oh, well, the unemployment rate's down. I think it had been like 18, so it's at 15. That's better than 18. Well, what makes it even worse, though, is about 10% of their labor force is emigrated. Okay, so that's not what I would ordinarily want to hold up as a success story. But the long and short of this is that, we have a number of countries now, and the UK, of course, joined the list 2 years ago. We have a number of countries that have tried austerity for a number of years. You cannot find the success story. So we both have the theoretical case, that the IMF, I think, has very effectively refuted with their chapter. And, we have enough cases. Again, I'm only putting up a couple here of austerity. I'm going to come back and talk about Germany in a few minutes. They're not really an austerity case at all. But you don't have a success story that you could point to, even though you have a number of countries across Europe, across the world, that have been trying austerity. There's nothing that really fits the bill. Okay, well, let's move on a second and talk about, what do we think would happen? What's the sort of, I like to say, the Keynesian common sense story. And you go, okay, well, what would they tell us? We have Alberto Alsina, or perhaps your prime minister, whoever, an advocate of austerity. What exactly is supposed to happen? What's the good story? We understand, we're cutting back government spending. We're raising the VAT. That's going to slow the economy. We understand that. You can't really dispute that. I mean, we're laying off government workers. That's got to slow the economy. We're raising the VAT. We're pulling money out of people's pockets. That got to slow the economy. So how do we get the growth? How do we get the expansion? Well, presumably their story looks something like this, that we're going to see a drop in interest rates, and that's going to lead to more investment and more consumption. Okay, well, what would that look like? To start with investment, these are non-residential investment for the UK, shares of GDP. What would it look like to have a big uptick in investment? Now, let's arbitrarily, in my paper, I said 6 percentage points of GDP. I think that's roughly the targets for reducing the deficit, but that's, could be 5, could be 8, doesn't really matter. The point is that to make this up with higher investment, you'd need a really big uptick in investment as a percentage of investment, in other words. So currently investment's roughly 12 percentage points of GDP. Suppose we said we're going to see a 6% drop in GDP because of cuts in government spending, increased taxes. We're going to make that up with investment. Okay, investment would have to increase by 50%. It'd be far higher than it's ever been. You've never had investment as 18% of GDP. I could put the US, it'd be the same story. We've never had that. So the idea that somehow we're going to have the cutbacks in government spending, we're going to raise taxes, reducing people's consumption, we're going to make it up on the investment side, it doesn't make any sense. You're not going to have investment at 18% of GDP. Furthermore, the whole mechanism, and there's a lot of research on this, it's one of the most heavily researched topics in economics, investment is not very sensitive to interest rates. Okay, firms, not surprisingly, firms, they go, okay, it's nice, we have to pay a little less in capital. Most investments financed internally anyhow, so it's not as though they're borrowing most of the money. Most of the money is coming out of corporate profits, and I don't know if the story's the same in the UK, probably is in the US. Firms are sitting on about $2 trillion in cash, so it's not as though they have to go in private markets. So interest rates, investment is just not very sensitive to interest rates. What investment is most sensitive to is demand. So you curtail demand, you cut government spending, you raise taxes so people cut consumption, you very well might be curtailing investment. It's very hard to tell the story that somehow you're going to get investment to bounce up to 18% of GDP, increased by 50%. Okay, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay, well, the second part of the picture, consumption. How are you going to do this with consumption? Well, consumption also is not particularly responsive to interest rates, so that doesn't seem to work very well. But the other question you have to ask is why? So we want private consumption rather than public consumption. Why? Why would you want that? You think this through for a minute. This is one that I was always struck by. So you could say, okay, if we could tell that first story, if we could tell the first story where we're going to cut back government spending, and let's say it's wasteful for the moment. I'm not saying it is, but let's give them that. We'll say it's wasteful. We're going to have investment. We'll be wealthy in the future. Fair enough. If we buy fit part one, we get the investment. But let's say we're not going to get the investment because there's no reason to think we will. So instead we replace public spending with consumption. Well, if the public spending was public investment, that's a loss, right? So we were building up our infrastructure, or improving people's education, research, whatever it might be. We replace that with private consumption. How is that a gain for the future? How does that make us better off? Okay, but even if it were public consumption, we replace public consumption with private consumption. Let's think about this for a moment. The main reason that consumption rose, you see your consumption rise from, it was down about 58% of GDP back in the 60s or 70s, and it rose to almost 70% at the peak of the bubble, about 65%. Well, the main reason it rose was your housing bubble. Okay, and housing bubble, housing wealth causes people to consume. Same story in the U.S. I have a very similar graph I always show at the U.S., and I got your data. By the way, this might look different from your own savings. This is the OEC data, so this might look different. I know it's different than the national savings. I don't know exactly how the UK calculates the national savings, but the OECD does it the same way as the United States, so I say that's the right way. But in any case, you know, it's the same direction. The numbers might not be exactly the same, and again, I don't know exactly the reason for the differences, but the same general direction. Point being here, you had very low private savings, in fact, negative savings rates just before the crash. What does that mean? Well, it means people aren't putting aside any money for retirement. And the logic, there was a logic in terms of the bubble that people didn't think they had to put aside money because their house price was doing it, the rise in house price was doing it for them. But the implication is that when people get to retirement, they're not going to have any money other than, you know, if they're lucky enough to own a home and have accumulated some equity, they'll have that. But is that what you really want? So is that a good thing? Let's imagine I'm saying, you know, we have our, you know, your government here, your prime minister's here. He's saying, well, we're going to have this big boost in private consumption. What he's telling us then is people aren't going to do any savings, so they're going to hit retirement with no money. So that's great, right? We've got a whole group of, you know, retirees, and they have no money other than, you know, whatever you might have by way of public support. How does that save us any money? That doesn't make any sense. And I should point out, you know, I always was yelling about the housing bubble in the U.S. before it collapsed. You know, I would add some warnings. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on UK's housing market, but I'll just point out, if you look at UK prices relative to prices in the US, in the mid-90s, before both of us had our big bubbles, your prices were about 80% of ours. This is a straight UK to dollar conversion. I didn't try and do purchasing power parity or anything, just straight dollar conversion. So your prices back then are about 80% of ours. Any ideas where they are now? It's about 200%. So I just say that as a caution. You could decide whether you want to sell your home, but you know. So anyhow, long and short, I don't think there's a good story to be told that somehow we're going to be saved by increasing consumption. A, it probably won't happen, and B, if it did happen, it would not be good. Okay. Well, the third part of the story, and this is, you know, I think where you'd say, okay. Suppose, you know, again, we had the proponents of austerity. How would we get the growth? Well, net exports. I mean, that would be a good story. You know, a good story in the sense that there's a logic to it, but also it would be a good thing if it actually happened. But as Brennan pointed out, it hasn't happened. Your deficit's increased. Well, that shouldn't be a surprise because who are you going to export to? Okay, in other times, you know, if we look back at their models, their successful examples of successful austerity, you know, there's small countries. There was Sweden in the early 90s. There was Ireland in the 80s. You know, these were cases where they had big drops in the currency and they had vibrant economies growing rapidly that were their major trading partners. Can you say that today? Okay, is the pound going to plummet against other currencies? And do you have vibrant trading partners that are going to, you know, sop up your exports? I don't think so. Okay, now over longer term, obviously that's the direction you want to go. U.S. and U.K. both. We shouldn't be running large trade deficits. It's a very serious imbalance. Our trade deficit's even worse than yours. That's a very serious imbalance in the economy. But it's not going to be corrected overnight, and it's certainly not going to be corrected when most of your trading partners are also in a slump. So my takeaway from this is, you know, whatever you could say for this idea of expansionary contraction, and there could be some argument there, it doesn't apply in the current circumstances. It's basically just a dead end. And the fact that we're seeing everything go the wrong way, that we're seeing you're getting into a double dip, economies across Europe are getting into a double dip, the fact that that's happening is exactly what Keynes would have predicted, and it should not be a surprise. And, you know, the remarkable thing is that, you know, here it is 70 whatever years since Keynes wrote, and we seem to have gone backwards, not forwards. So let me just say a couple things about, you know, getting out of this, the way forward. And, you know, I think it's very much along the lines Brendan was saying that, you know, we want to go back towards public investment, building up the economy. And then a few things, you know, some broader issues about, you know, making the economy more progressive, getting us back on a more equal footing. Okay, first off, you know, the obvious way to boost spending, boost the economy right now is public investment. And you know, again, it was very nice immediately after the downturn when you had the first G20 summits, and there was kind of a consensus among the G20 leaders that, yes, we want to do this. And it just makes kind of common sense that here you could borrow at very low interest rates. You know, your interest rates are pretty comparable to ours. 10-year rates are around 1.7, 1.8. These are the lowest they've been since the Great Depression. Why on earth wouldn't you take advantage of that? I mean, that's just kind of common business sense, right? When you could borrow very cheaply, that's when you do it. You have a lot of unemployed people in the U.S. Unemployment's worse in the construction sector. I don't know if it's quite the same in the U.K. I'm sure construction's been hard hit. So it's a great opportunity. You can borrow cheaply. You have unemployed workers. Why not put them to work building up your infrastructure? And, you know, one of the arguments we had in the U.S., and, you know, it's kind of painful. We had all these people, because our first stimulus, people forget, our first stimulus in the United States was actually in 2008 when we still had George W. Bush in the White House, February 2008. Unemployment rate is 4.7%. People said it's too high. Of course, we knew it was going higher, so in fairness. But in any case, so a lot of us were saying, well, we should do investment. We should do infrastructure. And the argument then was, well, that takes too long. Then, of course, we had President Obama come into office in 2009, again, stimulus, and a lot of us were saying, you know, we should do infrastructure. Say, well, that takes too long. Well, you know, we had plenty of time, and unfortunately, I think we still have plenty of time. So the idea it takes too long, you know, won't be the worst thing that, you know, we're planning projects today and, you know, they might not get undertaken till 2013, 2014, and they may still be going on in 2017. That's probably fine. You know, we will probably still need the demand then. I wish I could say that wasn't true, but, you know, these aren't my projections. These are projections from our Federal Reserve Board, the IMF. I mean, everyone, you know, they're all showing that. So we have the time, for better or worse. The second thing to keep in mind with public investments, not all of this takes a lot of time. I mean, one of the things we've done a little bit in the United States, but we could do an awful lot more, and I'm sure, again, it's probably the same in the UK, but not quite as bad, is retrofitting buildings. You know, our energy use on residential heating, cooling is just ridiculous. I mean, we built our buildings in the context of low-cost energy, you know, when oil was, you know, $10 a barrel, you know, and a lot of places are still insulated that way. I could say that's a little bit from personal experience, my N of one, but, you know, we moved into a home that was built in the early 20s, and we put in some insulation that paid for itself in 2 years. So, you know, I'm sure there's lots of examples like that across the United States, lots of examples like that across the UK. The reason for saying that, this is something that does not involve a lot of lead time. You know, you could set up programs to retrofit buildings fairly quickly, and you're doing them one at a time. So this isn't something that takes, you know, 3, 4, 5 years of planning. That could be done very quickly. And it has a very clear payoff. And, you know, even if every single case it's not going to pay off, the point is on average, I'm sure there would be a very, very good payoff. You know, the other things, you know, rebuilding schools, again, I don't know if the UK has the same story as the US, but we have a lot of schools that, you know, the roofs are caving in. Seriously. I mean, you know, not in wealthy areas, but, you know, in inner city, in Washington, we had schools, a number of schools that were shut down a few years ago because they didn't meet fire safety conditions. You know, so here you have kids in unsafe buildings. That shouldn't be a hard thing to get, you know, support to do. I mean, you should have done it anyhow, but in the context of a stimulus, that would make a lot of sense. So there's a lot of things you could do by way of public investment, as I say. Some of them are more long-term. Others could be done very, very quickly. Another thing that, you know, I think is a great success, and let me see if I go back here. Okay. One of the great success stories, and I understand people are more knowledgeable about this than in the United States, people point to Germany, you know, and you see the unemployment rate at the start of the downturn was about 7.5%. I think it was 7.6, 7.7. And today it's around 5.5%. So their unemployment rate's actually fallen by about 2 percentage points. So a lot of people in the United States look at that and they go, well, Germany's economy is booming. Well, Germany's economy is growing at about the same rate as the U.S. I mean, give or take, we have to look quarter by quarter. But if you look at, you know, from the start of the downturn at the end of 2007 to the present, the difference in growth is trivial. And again, I don't even know which one's higher or lower. You'd have to look at the most recent quarter's data. The reason why Germany's unemployment rate's fallen by 2 percentage points and the unemployment rate in the U.S. has risen by almost 4 is that Germany's gotten employers to keep people on the job, short work programs. That's really kind of an amazing story. I mean, they've managed to get employers, rather than laying off workers, they get them to work shorter hours, and the government makes up most of the shortfall in wages. This should be a fairly intuitive story. If we don't have work for people to do, how about we all work a little less and take home pretty much the same pay? That really makes a lot of sense. You know, if it's the case, you know, we go through our list of things we want the government to do by way of public investment, and we still have a big gap. Well, fine. Let's all just work fewer hours till we figure out what people, you know, what needs to be done. And in Germany, it's a great model. And I'm not going to say everything's great in Germany. I have friends in the German labor movement. They have many complaints, many of them well justified. So I'm not trying to say everything's great in Germany. But it's got to look a lot better when you have 5.5% unemployment in Germany than, you know, say the 8.2 we have in the U.S. and, you know, 8.4 that you have here. To say nothing of, you know, Ireland Ireland or Spain. So I think that's, you know, both the direction for the short term, but I would also say as a longer term story, and again, this is, you know, a bit more of a U.S. story than a U.K. story, but I think it's a similar picture here, that in the U.S. We've done very little by way of providing for paid time off. So you look at work weeks or work years, however you want to put it, in the United States, over the last 3 decades, there's been very little change. So in 1980, we worked roughly the same number of hours in a year as, say, people in Germany, people in Sweden. Today, people in Sweden and Germany work about 20% less a year than people in the United States. And the differences are, one, paid vacation. You know, in the EU as a whole, I think you have to have 4 weeks paid vacation. In Germany, I think it's 5. My wife's Danish, it's 6. They had a strike over that a few years ago. They compromised. They had 5. They wanted 6. They compromised at 5.5, and now they've gotten 6. So they have 6 weeks a year paid vacation, you know, paid parental leave, paid sick days. These are things that make really big differences to workers to know, you know, both they could have some time off that they count on be with their family, and also for these emergencies. In the United States, we don't have any of that. Okay, certainly none of it guaranteed by government. So obviously, if you have a, you know, relatively well-paying job, if you have a union job, odds are you have paid time off. Odds are you have, you know, paid sick days. You might have paid parental leave. Often you do, not everywhere. But most workers don't have that. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be talking about getting part of the gains of productivity growth in the form of more leisure time. And again, I realize this is probably more a U.S. story than a U.K. story, but I think to some extent it is a U.K. story as well. There's certainly more that could be done on that. Let me make a couple other points. You know, again, I know when I say that, and certainly when I say that to a U.S. audience, they go, what do you mean part of the gains of productivity growth? We haven't seen any of the gains. And that has been a very big issue. You know, in the United States, over the last 3 decades, the vast majority of gains of productivity growth have either gone to profits or high-end workers. Okay, so a really big part of any story has to be about increasing the bargaining power of ordinary workers. Part of that story clearly is unions. That makes a huge difference. Another part of the story, and I did some research on this, a friend of mine, a former colleague, Jared Bernstein, high levels of employment. We looked, you know, I was talking a moment ago about the late 90s. The only time that ordinary workers enjoyed sustained wage growth since the 70s was the period 96 to 2000 when we had very low unemployment. Unemployment has a huge impact on bargaining power. I mean, this isn't, you know, rocket science. It's kind of straightforward. You know, what happens when you have higher unemployment? Who gets laid off? It tends not to be doctors and lawyers and executive. It's, you know, the store clerks. It's the factory workers. When there's a lot of unemployed factory workers out there, your bargaining power is a lot less. Okay, in the United States, what we saw when we got the unemployment rate down to very low levels the most economists didn't think we could hit. You know, in the United States, they didn't think we'd get below 6% unemployment. So we got unemployment down to 5%, we got to 4%. That gave ordinary workers the bargaining power they needed to see wage gains. So that's a really, really important story. I emphasize that because I know in the UK, Europe, and now in the United States, there's a real focus on inflation targeting at central banks. You're not going to get low unemployment if inflation is the only goal of central banks. So in other words, if, you know, you have a 2% inflation target and you start to go a little bit above that because you're, you know, workers are seeing wage gains, and then the central bank slams on the brakes, they raise interest rates, you aren't going to see low unemployment. They won't allow that. That's a really, really big issue. We have to understand, and I'm saying this in a U.S. context at least as much as a U.K. context, central bank, this is political. And the idea that somehow they're just technocrats and, you know, God told them 2% inflation, no, that's nonsense. That's a very much political choice. And I should point out, inflation, you know, who does inflation hurt most? Finance. Okay, because the rest of us, you know, if your wages keep pace with inflation and then some, you know, obviously we'd rather see less inflation than more, but it's not a big deal, and we know that. We've had periods of modest inflation accompanied by good economic growth and good wage growth. I'll touch on a couple other things because I don't want to run on too long. The issue of CEO pay, I've come to appreciate this, and again, it's more of a U.S. problem than a UK problem, but I know it's a big problem here. I think it's actually a huge issue, and it's not just that you have a few CEOs get ridiculous pay, and in the U.S., as I say, it's much, much worse. Some of you might know the case, Hewlett-Packard, the huge computer company. They brought in a new guy as CEO. He lasted, I think it was 18 months. His big thing, he was going to have a tablet computer that was going to compete with Apple. They discontinued. It was a disaster. Everything went bad. Profits were down, stock price. It was failure by any measure. He walked away with $20 million. I mean, how many people, we get fired from our job and you walk away with, I mean, it's just an absurd story. But it's not just these guys. The point is that this sets pay scales that have resonance throughout the economy. So in the United States, what happens, not only do you have, pay scales for corporate executives that are crazy, but it permeates, university presidents. It's not uncommon for a university president to get over $1 million a year. And I don't just mean Harvard, fine, okay, there's one Harvard or whatever. But you have a lot of places that aren't Harvard where you have university presidents that are getting over $1 million or certainly in the high hundreds of thousands. Even charities, the people run charities, private charities in the United States. It's not uncommon to see people getting over $1 million. And their rationale is, look, I'm running this place and, we have, 5,000, 10,000 employees. If it were a private company of that size, I'd be getting, 10 million, and that's true. So I think it's really important to do what we can to bring down that pay, and I don't have a simple remedy. I mean, I know you have some things, on the agenda here, so I don't know exactly what will succeed, but I think it's a really important thing to rein in that pay. The other part of that story, remember, is that comes from somewhere. They always would have us think that, their pay just comes from heaven. So when we talk about pay that workers get, that's coming from the government, it's coming out of your pocket, but somehow the pay that the CEOs walk away with, that's just, whatever, No, that's out of our pockets, We have to be really clear on that. The second thing, and again, this is more U.S. context, I'm sure it's an issue here, patents and copyrights. Patent system, particularly patent system, it's just incredibly abused. And in the United States, there's nowhere it's more abused than in drugs. We spend close to $300 billion a year on prescription drugs. It's about 2% of our GDP. Now, the thing to keep in mind, and again, I say it's more with the U.S. audience, but I'm sure there's some issue here. Drugs are cheap. I mean, there are very few drugs that are expensive to produce. In the U.S., we have generic drugs. You can go to chain drugstores. You can get them for $5 a prescription. On the other hand, you get drugs that are patent protected. They can cost hundreds, sometimes thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars per prescription. That's because the government gave them a patent monopoly. This is incredibly bad economics. It's incredibly bad from a health perspective. All the things that economists like to rant about if you talk about trade protection. We're going to put a 20% tariff barrier on steel. We actually did that in the U.S. Turned out to be incredibly successful, saved our steel industry. But all the economists are ranting about, tariffs are really bad, protection, blah, blah, blah. Well, patent protection, we're not raising the price of a drug by 20% or even 200%. We're talking about 2,000%, maybe 20,000%. All the things that economists would say are bad about trade protection apply tenfold, 100-fold to patent protection. It leads to corruption, leads to Pfizer, Merck, the big drug companies. They lie all the time. Why do they do that? They have an enormous incentive to. Okay, and again, this connects back with the distribution of income because who's getting the money? Okay, there aren't a lot of poor people who have patent rights. Okay, so that should be something on our agenda. We have an interest in it, and at least in the U.S., it's a really, really big issue. The last thing I'll just mention, and this, again, front and center, finance. Both our countries have enormously bloated financial sectors. And the logic here, and again, I have a great time arguing about this with economists because they go, well, why do you want to crack down on the financial sector? Well, finance is an intermediate good. I mean, this is just, it's just kind of common sense. It's not, this isn't like housing that if we have more housing, we could at least hope we're better sheltered. If we get more health care, we're going to be healthier or whatever. Housing's an intermediate good. It doesn't directly provide a benefit. And as an economist, what you should say is, well, we want an efficient financial sector is a small financial sector. Think of it like trucking. Suppose our financial sector, and again, I'm speaking of the U.S., but I'm sure a comparable story in the U.K., our financial sector, our narrow financial sector, just commodities trading and securities trading, investment banking, so that narrow component of the financial sector has quintupled relative to the size of the economy in the last 3 decades. Now, what would we say if our trucking sector had quintupled relative? You go, well, are we getting better trucking services? Things get from, you'd like to see something for it. So you go, okay, well, with the financial sector, how has it benefited the rest of the economy over the last 3 decades? What are we getting today better then what we got is capital being better allocated. Are we more secure in our savings? Is it easier to start a business? I mean, you go down the list of things that, you know, we all want our financial sector to do. Is it doing it better than it did 3 decades ago? I think it's very, very hard to say that. So the long and short, I think it's an incredible bloat. And again, it's a bloat that leads to enormous inequality because this is a lot of the highest incomes in both the UK and the US. And again, it's not manna from heaven, it's coming out of our pockets. Okay, so I think we have to talk about clamping down on the financial sector. UK, I always hold up as a model, by the way, because I've been a big pusher of financial transactions taxes for 2 decades. And you know, people say you can't have it. You go, well, you guys have it. You have the stamp tax. And I remember I was having an argument with someone from the Obama administration, and they say, he was telling me, oh, we don't think you could raise anything like the revenue you're saying. So I mentioned, well, you guys, you have the stamp tax, you raise 2 to 3/10% of GDP just by taxing stock trades. And he said, yeah, we don't know how they do that. So anyhow, I think a more broadly based financial transactions tax would be a great, great thing. Breaking up the too big to fail banks, that's again something, I have a lot of conservative friends who agree with me completely. What's the argument? I mean, the whole logic of a too big to fail bank is that they're in effect relying on a government subsidy, that people lend them money for lower interest rates than they would otherwise with the idea that if they got in trouble, the government would bail them out. And there's a lot of good research on this. I've done some research on it. Others have done research on it. All find the same thing. Somewhere around 40 to 60 billion, this is in the US, 40 to 60 billion a year in annual subsidies in the form of lower interest rates. Why would you want that? What's the logic? Why on earth should the government be giving 40 to 60 billion to the stockholders, the top executives of the JP Morgan, a Citigroup, whatever big bank you want to point to? It makes no sense. So I would argue strongly that we should be looking to break up the too big to fail banks. There isn't really an argument on the other side. I mean, I've had exchanges with people and they go, how would you break up JP Morgan? And my answer is, I'm not going to break up JP Morgan. Jamie Dimon is going to break up JP Morgan. I mean, that's the logic. I mean, they know how to break it up. You just give them goals. You just say, you know, JP Morgan currently is about $2 trillion in assets. You go, we want you to be under $800 billion in 5 years, you know, all your subsidiaries. And under 200 billion or whatever number we pick in 10 years, you know how to do it. You know what's there. Maximize your shareholders' value. You know, you'll do it. You don't have the government bureaucrats do it. You have the corporate executives do it. That's fine, you know. So long and short, I think we really have to see finance as a very big enemy. Just the last point on finance, that, you know, the other thing we had, you know, you could point to this across really the whole OECD. We had a great alliance of labor and industrial capital. And I'm saying great, I don't mean everyone was happy, but I mean things were going in the right directions in the 3 decades following World War II. That really did change in the 80s with Reagan in the US, Thatcher in the UK, and you really saw the ascendancy of finance capital, and that's been a very, very different world. I think the path forward has to get back to something like, it won't be the same thing, but something like an alliance of labor with industrial capital, not industry alone, but that has to be a big part of the picture. And finance is a huge obstacle to that. So long and short, obviously we're in a very big hole. We have a lot to come out of. But, you know, I got the little pamphlet about the toll puddle martyrs. I was reminded of my E.P. Thompson, my labor history, you know, British labor history. We've been in much bigger holes, and we've gotten out of them. And we can do that. Stop with that.